in 10 months. Their bodies ended up on a lecture table, sold for the price of a good coat. Edinburgh in the 1820s was one of the great centres of medical training in Europe, ranked alongside Leiden in the Netherlands and Padua in Italy. Teachers like Alexander Monro, his son of the same name, John Bell, and John Goodsir had built the city's reputation on rigorous anatomical study, and the study of surgery depended on a steady supply of cadavers to dissect. Scottish law only permitted dissection of bodies from executed criminals, suicides, and unclaimed foundlings or orphans. As medical training grew more popular, that legal supply fell further and further behind demand. Students and lecturers turned to grave robbers, known as resurrection men, who dug up the recently buried and sold them on. Disturbing a grave was a crime, and stealing anything buried with the body was a crime, but the corpse itself belonged to no one under the law, so taking the body alone carried no penalty. Prices moved with the seasons, £8 in summer when heat sped up decay and there was less time to work with, £10 in winter when cold let anatomists keep a body longer and dissect it more thoroughly. Families fought back where they could. Some hired guards to sit by fresh graves through the night, or built watchtowers over cemeteries. Others paid for heavy stone slabs laid over a coffin until decomposition made the body worthless to a surgeon, or used mortsafes, iron cages bolted down over the grave itself. By the 1820s, Edinburgh residents were taking to the streets over the problem. The historian Ruth Richardson described the resulting mood among the city's anatomists as a growing atmosphere of crisis. Into that crisis stepped Robert Knox, who had qualified as a surgeon in 1814 and lost the use of one eye to smallpox as a child, leaving his face visibly scarred. He served as an army physician at Waterloo in 1815, then in southern Africa during the Cape Frontier War, before settling back in his home city in 1820. By 1825 he was a Fellow of the Royal College of Surgeons of Edinburgh, lecturing to more than 400 students at a time, twice daily, promising fresh anatomical subjects for every course he taught. William Burke was born in 1792 in Erney, County Tyrone, to comfortable, middle-class parents, and joined the Donegal militia as a young man before marrying a woman from County Mayo. In 1818, after a dispute with his father-in-law over land, he deserted his wife and family and moved to Scotland to labour on the Union Canal. He settled near Falkirk with a woman named Helen MacDougall, whom he called Nellie, and by November 1827 the couple had moved into lodgings at Tanner's Close in Edinburgh, where Burke worked as a cobbler and was known for singing and dancing on his customers' doorsteps. William Hare's early life is harder to pin down. Even his age at arrest, given as 21, is disputed by other sources suggesting he was born sometime between 1792 and 1804. Born near Newry, Ireland, he worked the Union Canal for 7 years before settling in Edinburgh, where he lodged in a house at Tanner's Close run by a man named Logue and his wife, Margaret. When Logue died in 1826, Hare may have married the widow himself. The historian Brian Bailey describes him, from contemporary accounts, as illiterate and uncouth, with old scars across his head and brow. Burke and Hare met in 1827 working a harvest together outside the city, and when Burke and MacDougall returned to Edinburgh, they moved into Hare's lodging house, where the two couples soon earned a local reputation for hard drinking. The first death, on the 29th of November, 1827, wasn't murder at all. A lodger named Donald died of dropsy at Hare's house, still owing £4 in back rent, just before a pension payment that would have covered it. Furious at the lost money, Hare and Burke opened the coffin a carpenter had supplied for the parish burial, hid Donald's body under a bed, and filled the coffin with bark from a local tannery to disguise the weight. After dark they carried the corpse to Edinburgh University looking for a buyer, and a student directed them to Knox's rooms in Surgeon Square. Knox came down himself to set the price at £7 10 shillings, Hare took £4 5 shillings to cover his lost rent, Burke the rest. As they left, according to Burke's later confession, one of Knox's assistants told them the anatomists would be glad to see them again if they had another to sell. They took the hint. In January or February 1828, a lodger named Joseph, a miller who had fallen into a feverish delirium, became the likely first deliberate killing. Hare suffocated him with a hand over the nose and mouth while Burke lay across the chest to stop him thrashing or drawing breath. The historian Lisa Rossner has called the method practically undetectable before the era of modern forensics, since Burke's weight prevented the lungs from expanding at the same moment Hare's grip cut off air. Knox paid £10 for that body. Around the same time, an English match seller from Cheshire, ill with jaundice, was killed the same way, and on the 12th of February a pensioner named Abigail Simpson, who sold salt in the city, was given enough whiskey at the Hare's house that she couldn't walk home. She was murdered and delivered in a tea chest. Burke's confession records that Knox approved of its being so fresh but, in that instance, did not ask any questions. The killings kept coming through the spring and summer. An old woman was smothered with a bed tick by Hare in February or March. In April, Burke met Mary Patterson and her friend Janet Brown in a tavern. Patterson was murdered asleep after a drunken afternoon that also triggered a jealous row between Burke and MacDougall. One of Knox's assistants, examining the still-warm body, thought he recognized her face and asked where it had come from. Burke told him she'd drunk herself to death and been bought from an old woman in the Canongate. Knox kept the body preserved in whiskey for 3 months before dissecting it. Mrs. Haldane was killed after falling asleep drunk in the stable, and months later her own daughter was murdered by Burke alone. A cinder gatherer named Effie, who'd sold Burke leather scraps for his cobbling trade, was lured in with whiskey and killed by both men together. In June, an elderly woman and her deaf-mute grandson were murdered on the same night. Burke later said the boy's face was the one memory that haunted him afterward, and the two bodies, too large for the usual tea chest, had to be forced into a herring barrel. Hare's horse refused to pull the loaded cart past the grass market, and Hare shot the animal dead in the yard afterward out of frustration. A falling out over money briefly split the partnership that summer when Burke discovered Hare had sold a body alone and pocketed the proceeds. They reconciled within weeks. In the autumn they killed a washerwoman named Mrs. Osler and a visiting relative of MacDougall's named Dougal, then in November murdered James Wilson, a well-known local figure with a limp, called Daft Jamie, who fought back hard enough that it took both men to hold him down. Students in Knox's dissecting room recognized Wilson's face the next day. Knox denied it could be anyone they knew and moved the body to the front of the dissection queue. None of these deaths drew serious police attention because none of the victims were people anyone with standing thought to search for: lodgers, beggars, drifters, exactly the population least likely to be missed. The scheme ended only because 2 witnesses stumbled onto a body before it could be moved. On the last day of October 1828, Burke lured a middle-aged Irish woman named Margaret Docherty into his lodging by claiming a shared family name with his mother back in Ireland. 2 other lodgers, and James Gray, were paid to spend the night elsewhere so the house would stay clear. By the next evening Docherty was dead, her body hidden in a pile of straw at the foot of a bed. The Greys returned to collect clothes for their children, and grew suspicious when Burke wouldn't let her near the bed where she'd left a pair of stockings. Left alone in the house that evening, she searched the straw and found the body, blood and saliva visible on the face. On the way to report it, the Greys ran into Helen MacDougall, who offered them £10 a week to stay quiet. They refused, went straight to the police, and Burke and Hare rushed the corpse to Knox's rooms ahead of them. Police found Docherty's blood-stained clothes hidden under a bed, and Burke and his wife gave conflicting accounts of when the woman had supposedly left. That inconsistency was enough to hold them, and the next morning police found the body itself at Knox's surgery. James Gray identified her on site. What the case never produced was hard proof. 2 forensic doctors, Robert Christie's son and William Newbing, examined Docherty's body and concluded she had probably been suffocated, but they could not prove it medically. Christie's son also interviewed Knox directly. Knox told him that Burke and Hare had explained their supply of bodies by claiming they watched over poor lodging houses and collected corpses before family could claim them for burial. Christie's son came away thinking Knox was, in his own words, deficient in principle and heart, but concluded he had broken no law. A later committee of inquiry cleared Knox outright, reporting they had seen no evidence that he or his assistants knew murder had produced any of the bodies delivered to his rooms. Whether that conclusion was accurate, or whether Knox simply chose not to look closely at what arrived on his table, was argued over bitterly by the Edinburgh public at the time, and no surviving record settles it either way. With no forensic proof and only circumstantial evidence against four suspects held together, prosecutors needed a confession. They got one by offering William Hare immunity if he testified against Burke. Hare's statement, given on the 1st of December, 1828, laid out Doherty's killing in full and, eventually, an account of all 16 deaths. Burke and MacDougall were formally charged on the 4th of December with 3 of the murders, Patterson's, Wilson's, and Doherty's, though the judge split the indictment into separate charges, and the prosecution chose to try the Doherty case first, since they had the body and the strongest EV.